The city had been dying for decades before anyone put a sword to it. By the spring of 1453, Constantinople held perhaps 50,000 people inside walls built for 500,000. The great Theodosian Walls still stood, nearly 1,000 years old, nearly 4 miles long, but the men available to defend them numbered somewhere around 7,000, soldiers and armed civilians combined. Mehmed II had somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 troops camped outside, depending on which account you trust. The disparity was not a secret. Everyone inside the city understood exactly what they were facing. What made the last week different was not the odds. It was the silence that started breaking. On the evening of May 22nd, a lunar eclipse passed over Constantinople, darkening the moon for hours. The Byzantines had an old prophecy that the city would never fall while the moon shone full. Whether people genuinely believed it or reached for it out of desperation is difficult to say from this distance. But surviving accounts describe visible alarm moving through the population after the eclipse ended. The next morning, a heavy fog settled over the city, which was unusual for late May in that region. When it lifted, witnesses reported seeing a strange light flickering around the dome of the Hagia Sophia. Ottoman observers across the water apparently saw it too and interpreted it as a divine sign in their favor. Both sides were reading the same sky and finding entirely opposite meanings in it. Inside the walls, Emperor Constantine XI had been making decisions for weeks that had no good outcome attached to them. He had sent urgent requests to Venice, to Genoa, to the Pope, to Hungary, asking for ships, soldiers, anything. Very little came. A handful of Genoese ships, a few hundred volunteers, promises that dissolved into diplomatic correspondence. The Venetian fleet that might have made a difference was in the Aegean, waiting for clearer orders that never arrived in time. Constantine knew this. By mid-May, he almost certainly knew that no significant relief force was coming. What he chose to do with that knowledge says something about the position he was in. He kept the information from spreading as long as he could, because panic inside a besieged city is its own kind of collapse. The walls still had to be manned. The gates still had to be watched. The repairs still had to happen each night. Mehmed's artillery had been working on the walls since early April, 7 weeks of sustained bombardment. The largest cannon he brought, cast by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, could fire a stone ball weighing around 500 kilograms. It could only be fired about 7 times a day because it needed to cool between shots. But over 7 weeks, that adds up. Sections of the outer wall had been breached and re-breached repeatedly. The defenders had developed a rhythm. Ottoman cannon fires, stone collapses, Greek and Genoese workers rebuild overnight with rubble and timber. It was exhausting work, done by men who were already rationing food and sleeping in shifts. The Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani Longo had held the most vulnerable section near the Blachernae wall for weeks. He was respected, experienced, and by late May he was also wounded, though accounts differ on how seriously at that stage. Inside the city, ordinary life had contracted into something very narrow. Markets that had operated for centuries were largely empty. The harbor chain across the Golden Horn still held the Ottoman fleet out, but Mehmed had already solved that problem weeks earlier, in one of the more audacious logistics operations of the siege. In late April, his engineers had greased a land road with animal fat and hauled approximately 70 Ottoman ships overland. They dragged them on wooden rollers from the Bosphorus shore over a hill and down into the Golden Horn behind the chain. It took one night. When the sun came up, there were warships inside the harbor that had not been there the evening before. The psychological effect on the defenders was significant. The chain had represented a guarantee, and the guarantee had just been bypassed. Constantine's council met repeatedly in those final days. The minutes of those meetings did not survive in any complete form. What historians have reconstructed suggests debate about whether to attempt a breakout, whether to negotiate, whether to hold every position equally. Some Venetian and Genoese commanders reportedly pushed to concentrate the defense at the most threatened points. There were tensions between the Latin Western volunteers and the Greek Byzantine soldiers, old religious and political frictions that did not disappear under siege. The union of the Eastern and Western churches, signed in Florence in 1439, and deeply unpopular in Constantinople, still cast a shadow. Some in the city reportedly said they would rather see the Ottoman turban than the Latin cardinal's hat, meaning they distrusted the Catholic allies as much as the enemy outside. That division cost the defense something real, in coordination, in trust, in the willingness to follow a unified command. On May 25th, Mehmed called his own council. Some of his commanders were also growing cautious. The siege had gone on longer than expected. Supply lines were stretched. Disease moved through large camps. There were voices among his advisors suggesting a negotiated withdrawal before something went wrong. Mehmed rejected that. He had staked his reputation, his treasury, and the first years of his reign on this siege. He was 21 years old. He had planned this campaign since before he took the throne. He announced that the final assault would come on May 29th, giving his men 2 days to rest and prepare. In Constantinople, the night before the assault was described by several later accounts as strangely quiet. Constantine XI reportedly walked through the city, through the Hagia Sophia, speaking with soldiers and civilians. Whether the specific words attributed to him are accurate is uncertain. They were written down later, shaped by what came after. But the movement itself, a ruler walking his city the night before its fall, has a weight that doesn't require embellishment. The lamps were burning. The walls were cracked. The men on the ramparts could hear the Ottoman camp across the narrow strip of no man's land. And in a few hours, before sunrise on May 29th, the drums would start. The assault began in the dark, somewhere around 1 or 2 in the morning by most accounts. Mehmed's strategy was layered, and that layering was deliberate, not improvised. He sent the irregular troops first, the Bashi bazouks, poorly equipped men drawn from various regions with no guaranteed pay. They were expendable in the coldest logistical sense, meant to exhaust the defenders before the real assault arrived. They hit the walls with noise and pressure and died in significant numbers against the Theodosian fortifications. The defenders held. Giustiniani's men at the Blachernae section fought them back with crossbows, handguns, and Greek fire. After roughly 2 hours, Mehmed pulled the irregulars back and sent in the Anatolian regulars. These were better trained, better armed, and they pushed harder against the same battered sections of wall. The fighting at the stockade near the Blachernae gate became the hinge point of the entire battle. This section had been patched with timber and rubble for weeks, and it was weaker than the ancient stone on either side. Giustiniani was wounded during this phase, seriously this time. A shot through his armor according to most sources, though the exact circumstances vary. What happened next became one of the most debated moments of the entire siege. He asked Constantine for the key to a small rear gate so he could be carried inside the inner wall for treatment. Constantine reportedly pleaded with him to stay. Whether that exchange happened exactly that way is uncertain. But Giustiniani left the wall. His Genoese troops saw their commander being carried away, and the effect was immediate. Some held, others followed him toward the gate. The discipline that had kept that section intact for 7 weeks began to fracture. At almost exactly that moment, or close enough that the timing felt decisive, a separate problem emerged. A small postern gate called the Kerkoporta on the northern end of the Blachernae wall had been left unlocked. Whether by accident, by negligence, or by something more deliberate has been argued ever since, without a clean resolution. A group of Ottoman soldiers found it, pushed through, and were suddenly inside the outer wall. They climbed to the ramparts and raised Ottoman flags. Defenders on nearby sections saw the flags and something broke. The word spread faster than any order could contain it. The walls are taken, the Turks are inside. It was not entirely true yet. The breach was small. A determined counter-response might have contained it. But the psychological collapse was faster than the physical one, and in a siege that is often how the end arrives. Constantine XI reportedly removed his imperial regalia when he understood what was happening. He did not want to be captured and displayed as a trophy, which was a reasonable fear given the politics of the moment. He is said to have ridden toward the fighting, toward the breach, and to have disappeared into it. His body was never conclusively identified. Several accounts claim a body matching his description was found and buried. Others suggest he died fighting anonymously in the final chaos near the gate. The honest answer is that nobody knows exactly how Constantine XI died, and the sources that claim certainty were written long after the fact. By mid-morning on May 29th, Ottoman soldiers were moving through the streets of Constantinople. The population that had not fled to the harbor was seeking shelter, most of them inside the Hagia Sophia. There was an old belief that an angel would descend and drive back any invader who entered that building. The doors were barred. Thousands pressed inside. The angel did not come. Ottoman soldiers broke through the doors within hours, and the people inside became captives under the laws of war as Mehmed's forces understood them. Mehmed himself entered the city in the afternoon, by most accounts riding to the Hagia Sophia first. He is reported to have dismounted, picked up a handful of earth, and poured it over his head as an act of humility before God. Whether that gesture is historically precise or later shaped by hagiography is genuinely unclear. What is documented is that he ordered the building converted into a mosque, and that the looting of the city was permitted for 3 days, a standard practice in 15th century siege warfare. The looting itself was not unlimited chaos. Mehmed wanted a functioning capital, not a ruin. He stopped the destruction of major buildings relatively quickly and began issuing orders to repopulate the city. Within months, he was inviting Greek, Armenian, and Jewish communities to resettle inside the walls. He styled himself Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome, claiming the imperial inheritance of the city he had just taken. That was not mere vanity. It was a political argument directed at the whole of Europe and the Islamic world simultaneously. The fall of Constantinople sent a specific kind of shock through Western Europe, though what that shock produced is more complicated than the dramatic version suggests. Some historians have credited it with accelerating the Renaissance by pushing Greek scholars westward with their manuscripts. The actual movement of Byzantine scholars to Italy had been happening for decades before 1453, so the causation is messier than that clean story implies. What the fall did more directly was close or complicate eastern overland trade routes to Asia, which pushed European maritime powers to look for alternatives. That pressure was real, and its consequences, the Portuguese rounding Africa, Columbus sailing west, were not immediate, but they were connected. The Theodosian Walls, which had held for over 1,000 years against Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, and Rus, finally came down not because they failed structurally. They came down because the city behind them had been hollowed out over 2 centuries of civil war, plague, economic collapse, and abandoned alliances. Mehmed's cannon was the final pressure, but the vulnerability had been accumulating for generations. That is the part that tends to get lost when the fall of Constantinople is told as a sudden dramatic event. It was sudden on May 29th. It had been arriving for a very long time before that. As with much of this history, accounts differ across Byzantine, Ottoman, Venetian, and Genoese sources, and some details remain genuinely contested by historians today. But the walls came down, the city changed hands, and 1,000 years of one particular version of Rome came to its end on a Tuesday morning in late spring.